Hello and welcome to Arvos of Harvo. Sorry for the terrifying bright lighting today. I swear it's 5 o'clock, but right now it is dark and winter is very intense here. We've got 7 more books this month. Okay, this is really dangerous. I don't really want to do a clap. So I didn't read this huge one. I read just one novel as part of it, but yeah, I got a lot done this month. Very much a classics catch-up kind of month, getting through things that I really should have read earlier, but finding things that are some of my favorites, some things that I also just didn't like quite as much, but let's get right into it. Alright, book number 1 is The Good Soldier by Madox Ford. His actual name is nothing like this. His actual name is Ford Herman Hoefer, born in Surrey, but he goes by Madox Ford. This novel is... It's a modernist novel, and it's very much the precursor to what I recognize now, today, as the kind of man booker style. It's a literary novel. Actually, it's by an author who's not really a literary author, and one day he decided, let's try to write the best book that I physically can, and he created this. I did not like it. It's okay. It is not about soldiers or war at all, which is why it was just a little bit confusing to get a grasp of what's going on here. It's really about two couples living in, well, going abroad in Germany, but their relationship is extremely tumultuous. We have our unreliable narrator, his partner who passes away quite early or midway into the book. We have his kind of like a friend, someone that he comes by, Edward Ashburnham. And he's a soldier. He's the good soldier of the novel, but his morality is also a little bit suspect, and his relationship with his wife is also a bit suspect. It's a novel about people cheating on each other. It's just about how all these characters can't hold a good and meaningful relationship, and so they find pleasure in other people, in other places, other behaviors. How nobody is really trustworthy, and our narrator especially so. He becomes more and more unreliable as the novel goes on, as we start to find out more about what happens across this holiday and in the lives of all the characters. We start to think, is he responsible for just how messed up his friendship and his relationships are? Is he an agent in all of this? Did he deliberately go out to commit so much adultery and to make friends with these people who are really not that trustworthy? Or is it more a narrative about how all human beings universally have difficulty being monogamous? Like, this is the modernist novel. This is the novel about society breaking down, relationships breaking down, what happens when things fall apart, and how we can question ideas of good and bad. Yeah, I didn't like it very much. It's the writing's a little bit hard to follow sometimes. I find this with all unreliable narrative stories, but this one especially, it's sometimes hard to figure out exactly what's happening and when it's happening because of the non-linearity of it. And also, we get introduced to all these characters quite early on, and we don't know what kind of significance they have. It's the kind of book where you need a notepad as you read, or maybe you want to read it a second time with the foreknowledge of everything that's about to happen. And from there, you can scrutinize the characters, but it's a laborious process. I was almost going to say tedious, but let's stick with laborious. It's a novel that requires you to work for the meaning, but from all I can find about the meaning, it's just about people being bad. That's it. I already knew that people were bad. You didn't need to tell me this. This gets a 3 out of 5. Book number 2 for June. The previous one was the aesthetic cover, by the way. I really like the... I just really like Forbist art. I really like... bright, striking colors and shadows. I think this one is a great cover. The book did not give me any feelings, anything like this cover, but yeah, it looks cool while I read it. Book number 2 is Interview with the Vampire by Anne Rice. This is a Southern Gothic horror vampire story. Actually really fascinating because for most of the 1900s, the vampire as a horror creature was not particularly utilized. I can't think of too many stories that used it. There is, of course, Dracula in the 1800s, but between then, I think the vampire is a very restrictive individual to use for a horror story. The vampire has so many rules attached to it, so many expectations, but I find that out of all the different kinds of novel, fictional monsters, vampires are hard to write about effectively. And this one kind of put vampires back on the map, honestly. In the I want to say 90s, I could be wrong, 1970s? This is a lot older than I thought it was. Goodness. This novel brings the vampire into the modern day. It's this kind of more dramatic, more sexy, more extreme representation of the vampire. We follow our protagonist. I have the worst time remembering the protagonist's names. This one's written in first person, so I have my excuses there. We have a vampire that we're following. I'm just not even going to bother. He is giving an account of his life to a young journalist, and he's trying to explain how he became a vampire, why he became the kind of person that he did, and this whole overarching narrative about what it means to be a vampire, what kinds of things was he able to do, why has he done what he's done. And we're following this narrator. His name's Louis. Took me a while. We follow Louis engaging with this older vampire, the person who made him into a vampire, Lestat. And Lestat is a remorseless, emotionless, ancient vampire who is from Louisiana, and he's just trying to live very pragmatically in Louisiana. Lestat is trying to teach Louis the kind of emotionlessness that you need to succeed as a vampire, whereas Louis has compassion. He's a very thoughtful and soulful person. He cares for people. He has a huge difficulty feeding on other human beings. He's often really racked with emotional and moral guilt over what he is and what he does, and yet he is conflicted because of his need to survive as a vampire and his needs to feed, his needs to find somewhere to live, and the really cruel treatment that vampires get from humans. Because to me, one of the most poignant scenes in the whole novel is early on, he tries to do this good deed. He tries to protect somebody who was really vulnerable, and he goes to her and he reveals himself as the person who protected her, and she's just horrified. She's like, you have to imagine seeing a real vampire, how scared and how reactive you would be. And for someone like Louis who was just trying to help, he realizes that, oh, he's just going to be treated like a monster for the rest of his life. Like, that really got to me. And then as the novel develops, we have a younger vampire named Claudia, and what's really interesting too is, I was told this by my coworker, the novel's based on Anne Rice's own personal experiences with losing a child quite young, and her writing this young female vampire character of Claudia is trying to reckon with that grief, and knowing that, it makes the book really much more poignant because Claudia complicates things so much. She, similarly to Lestat, has this emotionless streak, and Louis has to consider if he's going to take a caretaker role for her, and also what that really means, because Claudia is stuck looking like a child for her entire existence, but she's ancient, she's immortal, she's a vampire. So what does that mean? How do they exist? How do they make meaning of their lives or their eternal existence? It's very visceral, very sensationalized, very melodramatic. There's scenes later on that get very charged with violence and sex, and it's really quite overwhelming. It really gets to you. I quite liked it. I thought the way the narrative flowed on was quite nice. I like the framing device with the interviewer. Louis is a fantastic character. Claudia and Lestat are also really just imaginative, magnetic characters. They work so well. So I had a great time reading this. This is a 4 out of 5. Whoa, book number 3, let's talk about Moby Dick. This is my aquatic book for June of 2023. This is a book that I was supposed to read at university in a course called Trans-Pacific American Literature. And I was a fool because I got my oceans mixed up. I thought it was going to be a course about comparing American and British literature, not realizing that the ocean between America and the UK is the Atlantic Ocean, not the Pacific Ocean. And so this course, Trans-Pacific English Literature, was about boat narratives and ship narratives, stories from America exploring the Pacific Ocean, Pacific Islands, and the different kinds of tensions that occur, whether it's the powers of mutiny on a ship or whether it's the contact with island natives in the Pacific Islands. All these different ways that American power and hegemony are destabilized in a naval narrative. I found the course very fascinating, But one thing that I really lamented was that there were two Herman Melville novels set for study. There was Omu, which was a travelogue, and there was Moby Dick. And I did my presentation on Omu. It was one of the most challenging reads of my life. I found it really, really difficult because it's just boring. It's long. There's lots of descriptions about ships and exploring and island natives, and it was a little bit racist, and it was just hard for me to get through. And I'd heard that Moby Dick gets described in a very similar way. People say half of this book is ship facts, the other half is whale facts. And for the longest time, I just thought, I'm not going to read that. I knew it was set for study, but I knew also that I wasn't going to write an essay that had both Omu and Moby Dick in it, so I just kind of set it aside. And so it took me the longest time to get back to it, but it's also just such a weighty classic if you want to study American literature. Everybody knows this book. Everyone has to have read this book. This is like, I said this to someone, it's the final boss of American literary studies. It's just so much critical discourse goes straight back to here. And it always makes me think, why does it matter so much? Like, why does this book about ship facts and whale facts have so much gravity in the grand scheme of American literary studies? And so I sat down, I read it. I really loved it. I loved it so much. I can't believe how much I loved it. It's crazy. I never wanted to be the person who is saying Moby Dick is the greatest work of English literature. It's incredible. It's like everyone should read it because it sounds so pretentious. But goodness, it is a wonderful book. It is an excellent book. And it's not even, the description of it being ship facts and whale facts is not even incorrect. It is absolutely just, for the most part, about ships and whales. I just don't understand how the writing style makes ships and whales so compulsive and so relevant to life, that all the roles in a ship are connected to what people do in their course of life. All the knowledge that we have of whales is about humanity and humanity's relationship with nature, humanity's relationship with creatures that are just so much bigger and further beyond our comprehension, that it makes us really question who we are and what role do we play in an ecosystem. Isn't it weird that 18th century society has built itself around whale blubber, that their way of running lamps, of making perfumes, of just commerce is built around sailing around the world and killing whales and harvesting their various secretions? It's just so bizarre. And to me, it's this weird parallel too with fossil fuels, of mining, that the only way our current 21st century world can exist is from some black rocks in the ground. It's just, it reveals the truth of our modern life by being so detached from it, by giving us this narrative of a ship and a whale, something that the reader has never really been on or never really experienced. It allows Herman Melville to create metaphors that are directly connected to our life on land, that he can express what it's like to live as an ordinary human being better because he has this really alien set of comparisons to make on the ship. It's just, that's my best attempt of explaining why it's so good, but I still don't feel satisfied. It's so good. It's so perceptive of all the little details of our lives. He's able to describe even just the most basic of whaling terminology, how the ships get dropped, how they find their whales, how do they chase a whale, and how do they keep their sailors safe. All these little things are always constantly connected to just your life. It feels like the book is speaking directly to you, and you often feel like you're asking the book, I bet this is not going to be relevant. And just at the right moment, Herman Melville was just going to say, yes, it is relevant, and here is why it's relevant. And so the 600 pages of ship facts and whale facts just flew right by. The plot, we should talk about the plot. The plot is so simple. The plot is like 3 sentences. We have Ishmael, one of the most famous lines of literature, Call Me Ishmael. He is drawn to the sea, and so he goes on this whaling boat with Queequeg, who is a harpooner. There's lots of very funny moments early on with Ishmael and Queequeg. Actually, quite refreshingly, Queequeg is, I think, a Pacific Islander, and Ishmael and Queequeg immediately become very close friends, to the point that it kind of refutes the racist and xenophobic attitudes of books at the time. yes, it's not a perfect depiction, but on the ship there are characters of all sorts of different races, and they are treated with the utmost of respect because they are prized in the terms of their ability to run the ship, to hunt for whales. It's this democratization because on land in America, at the time the book was written, there was still slavery, there was still segregation, there was still like really systemic racism, and then you get on this ship and everything's fine. Everything breaks down because values and hierarchies don't apply on the ship in the same way they do on land. It allows the book to have this kind of longevity because it doesn't feel as rooted in the values of its time. Instead, it's just unique to the ship. It's unique to this tiny little microcosm of men hunting after this whale. And so that's the characters, that's the plot, the setting, and then we have Ahab. Captain Ahab is a real mystical kind of figure. He has a peg leg because the whale Moby Dick bit it off in a previous altercation, and so he's like furiously chasing after this white whale. He's made this whale into his life. The only thing valuable to him is to go hunt it down, and that's the kind of broad strokes of Ahab. I feel like when people talk about Moby Dick, they talk about Ahab, they talk about the maniacal desire to go hunt this whale, but you really feel it. You really feel how everybody else on the ship can follow Ahab because of his just sheer determination and sheer passion. That every little bit of his life is devoted to getting revenge on this fish. It's like he's let the fish consume him, metaphorically and physically. Like, it's taken part of his leg, but it's also taken his entire life. That he won't feel satisfied or happy or fulfilled or alive or human if he's not able to go and kill the whale. And this passion is really infectious. Even as I know intellectually it makes no sense for the ship to go kill the whale. And even though Herman Melville explains to us lots of times that there's no value in this whale is dangerous and it's hard to find and it's not part of the industry at all. None of the people on the ship are going to get rich from killing this one specific whale. In fact, they abandon more lucrative searches to try and find this white whale. And yet, confounding all logic, confounding all reason, all good sense, Ahab is just like, kill the whale, kill the whale, kill the whale. And you follow along, and you want to see the whale, and you want to see him kill the whale. It's such an interesting depiction of individual desire, that everybody in life has this thing that they've placed all of their belief and value into. And they are spending their whole earthly existence hunting the whale. And if they are so strongly motivated, then people will gravitate towards them to help them fulfill their mission, because they have found a way to create something with meaning and something with value. They have found a way to build a monument to human achievement and human endeavors. And that, in its own way, no matter what that monument is, even if it's as silly as killing this whale, it's inspiring. It's complex. I could keep talking about this book for hours and hours. I have so many things to say about it, and I think part of it is also just that I'm shocked of how much I enjoyed the Ship and Whale book, but it is a very, very good book. It's a very good book. I give it a 5 out of 5, and I really highly recommend not reading it because it's a Ship and Whale book. I feel like everyone's going to get bored. No one's going to feel the same way I do. I'm going to feel super pretentious. But I really liked it. I really did. It's a good book. It's about ships and whales. Book number 4 is The Leopard by Tomasi di Lampedusa. This is an Italian book. It's translated from the Italian. Very famous in Italy, from what I can find. It's a book written in the 1960s, but it is 1950s, sorry. But it is about the end of the monarchic system in Italy. So it's set in the 1860s. It's about a prince named, well, he's known as the Leopard, and it's about how his family and the actions of his family kind of lead or feed into the downfall of the whole monarchic system. We see in this novel a big referendum or election in order to instate democracy over the monarchy. and we see the impacts of this on the various characters. I found this so hard to read. I had a really hard time, and I don't know, I think maybe I was classic doubts, or maybe I just didn't have the attention span. Maybe I was surprised by how easy Moby Dick was to read, that I just couldn't really get into this, but I had a hard time. I couldn't connect with the characters, I couldn't really understand the political intrigue of what's happening. I really should read it again, honestly. I feel like I haven't given this book the attention that it really deserves, because it's famous. It's really well known in, well, Italy, but also around the world. It's an interesting meditation on politics and political power, and changing over where you situate your political power, whether it's in the gentry, the kind of people who have been there the whole time, or whether we are transitioning to some kind of new system. That moment is very interesting, I think, to understanding most modern politics, because every country has gone through this process. Every country has started with a more hereditary, hierarchical, feudal system, and moved towards a more modernized, democratic attitude. And we've read this in books before, even in something like The Great Reclamation from last year. We had this, or last month, I think, we had the same theme. And so seeing this play out in lots of different countries is interesting, but also challenging. I feel like this book is written for an Italian audience. It's not designed to be as universal as some of the other books that I've read this month, and so I did have quite a hard time with it. I probably would want to change this rating in the future, but for now I give it a 3 out of 5. Book number 5. This is very heavy, so I'm not going to hold it up the entire time. I read A Tale of Two Cities by Charles Dickens, and this is the omnibus, so there's one of 4 novels in here. There is Oliver Twist, A Christmas Carol, Tale of Two Cities, Great Expectations. I'm teaching Great Expectations for a high school class at the moment, and on my second read of that novel, I really liked it. I really enjoyed it. I thought it was just very clever, very well written. The characters are very well realized, and I thought, you know what, maybe I should give Charles Dickens another chance, because I'd only read 2 of his novels so far. I've read Great Expectations and I've read A Christmas Carol. I didn't love either of them the first time I read them, so this time I went for A Tale of Two Cities, which I think is probably... It's either this or Hard Times. It's the shortest of the Charles Dickens novels, and so perhaps it's the good starting point, because he is known for writing ridiculously long novels. So A Tale of Two Cities is something like 1,400 words. It's not short, but it is short for Dickens' standards. It's set in the French Revolution. Actually, it's between London and France. That's the Tale of Two Cities. It's around that historical period. It starts with those famous lines, was the best of times, the worst of times. I didn't realize what it was going to be. I've heard it described as 200 pages of setup, followed by the 50 greatest pages ever written in the English language. I didn't think it was that good. It didn't have that reputation for me. So what we're following is we have... the names completely escape me. So we have Miss Minette and Dr. Minette. They come over from France to England to live and reside, and we have a group of lawyers who are really the main protagonists of the book. They managed to get some French spies, or a French spy named Charles Darnay, acquitted, and so they're all living together in England happily. Meanwhile, the French Revolution is beginning. We have the Defarges, who own a wine shop, and they become this novel's stand-in for the ringleaders of the French Revolution. We see them plan the kinds of revolutionary actions that are about to happen, and then we see them at the forefront of all the violence that is about to happen. It is a brutal, gruesome book. It is much more violent than I thought it was going to be. I don't know why I thought Charles Dickens was like this reserved and modest and classy kind of writer, and this book is not. This book, midway through reading it, I was like, this feels like The Purge. This feels like the Victorian era version of The Purge, because it's not meaningfully violent. Instead, it seems to delight in the representation of violence. It's really graphic for the sake of titillating audiences or shocking audiences. The violence doesn't feel well placed. It doesn't feel like it should be there. And I mean, the obvious kind of argument of that is that it's written about the French Revolution, which historically was very violent, but even then, the way that the violence is phrased, to me, just seems overbearing. To me, And this is probably my biggest criticism of the work. It feels like an English writer criticizing France. It feels like all the British characters in this novel are good, regardless of their social class, regardless of their standing in society. They do big, good things. Lots of very big, very good things. And then the French characters, or at least during the Revolution, the French are represented as like animals. They're represented so cruelly. There's an early scene where there's a wine cask that falls over, and the people in the streets are just scavenging the wine. They're digging into gutters. They're drinking it alongside with mud. It's this desperation and animalistic imagery that I feel like the novel then suggests turns into the violence of the French Revolution. It's almost as if the novel is saying the French had this problem, whereas the British didn't. We somehow avoided this violent retribution, which oversimplifies the French Revolution. I feel like this novel, it tries. It has a few scenes where it does criticize aristocracy, but never to the extent that it provides a meaningful depiction of the French Revolution. I don't think it's trying to be political in any way or to present any kind of political opinion. Instead, it's just using the violence of the French Revolution to tell this love story of Miss Manette and Charles Darnay, which is, it's fine, it's okay. It's like a high-stakes love story. It's like a love story in a zombie apocalypse, or a love story in The Purge. They need the French Revolution in order to give the story stakes, and it's a thriller. It's a suspenseful novel. There's lots of things happening. There's lots of violent acts happening. The characters are often being threatened of their lives all the time. And so it's a bit of a pulse-pounding, quick read for the 1800s. But meaningfully and thematically, I found this to be very weak. I thought it was just too shallow, not properly exploring all the characters that we should care about, to the point where I knew what happened, and I knew why the characters did what they did, but I didn't feel what the characters felt. They do all these extreme actions which should bring about triumph, joy, sadness, wistfulness, longing, all of these meaningful emotions that I just didn't get because it's happening so fast and the characters are being introduced so quickly, and there's so much fixation on graphic depictions of violence that I feel like a lot of the good qualities of Charles Dickens that I saw in Great Stations, all that kind of gets left by the wayside, and what we have left is a thriller novel written in long and overbearing sentences, and I just didn't like it very much. I'm very sorry. It's a 3 out of 5. Okay, and book number 6 for June. This is a Clockwork Orange by Anthony Burgess. I thought it was going to be easy. I really did. Look how small it is. It is tiny. It is like a pinch size of book. I thought I could read it in a day. I could not, because it's barely written in English. It's written in Nadsat, which is like a teenage language. There's a glossary at the back, but actually I found out that the original publication, or this was in the original publication, but Anthony Burgess did not want a dictionary of Nadsat to be in his novel. He wanted readers to just try and experience the book, given that the narrator, Alex, is a teenager, hangs out with a bunch of violent teenager friends. He wants the audience to experience this foreignness to his language. And it leads to this kind of weird reading experience because the words are a one-to-one connection to what they really mean, and sometimes they're just extremely obvious. Alex will use the word horror show to describe good, and so he'll often say like, "That was a horror show day," or "a horror show thing," or "a horror show depiction," and it always just means good. It's genuinely as if the author Control-F'd the word good and replaced it with horror show. And so it doesn't feel like the way that slang gets used in real life, or different languages get used in real life. We often have conversations about English slang of the youth, and people saying phrases that have debatable meanings, like cap. If you say something's cap, or there's no cap, like, it doesn't just mean one thing. It's not a word-to-word definition. It's a concept that exists for youth that doesn't exist for the older generation. And so, to me, Nadsat felt like a little bit of a missed opportunity in that it just is very simple, but I understand why I did it. It works quite well for what he did. So the premise of this novel is that it's the near future. Teenage gangs are wreaking havoc across London, and so they are running around committing ultra-violence, beating people up, taking their stuff, cutting their clothes off, having gang fights. People can't stand it. It's just terrifying. They can't get out there. They're all drugged up on milk. And so we have a narrator whose name's Alex. Whoa, what was that? Alex is running around with his friends. He steals things, breaks into people's houses, generally untrustworthy, and he gets sent to jail. I'm basically going to spoil maybe 60 to 70% of this novel, because all this novel is the plot, and the plot is quite well known. I would say that even before I went to reading this novel, I knew basically 80% of what happens. So I think that most people like this as well, which is I'll talk about it. Otherwise, how will I even talk about this novel? But if you don't want spoilers, of course, skip to the next book. Alex gets caught, gets sent to jail, and in jail, he gets subjected to something called the Ludovico technique, where his eyes are taped open and he is force-fed images of really gruesome, grotesque violence and other shameful acts, to the point where every time he sees this, he's physically repulsed. It creates a psychological conditioning in him where he's just unable to commit violence anymore. It's taken away his ability to commit those violent acts, or even to witness them, because they produce in him this sense of nausea and fear and dread that he's just a whole different person at this point, which the novel is very much interested in discussing. The novel loves to think about whether or not this technique is good or meaningful, because there's a discussion of whether or not it takes away your free will, whether or not it's even good for society, and we have just one of the most heartbreaking depictions of Alex, where he's acting against his will. He knows what he wants to do, but because of the repulsion in his mind, because of the Ludovico technique, he's doing absurd things, and he's totally conscious of himself doing it. It's genuinely so sad. I felt so much sympathy for this kid who 3 or 4 chapters earlier was like beating people up, taking their money, committing sexual violence, like horrifying things. Despite my dislike of him earlier, no one deserves to be treated like this. It really made me feel for this. And what's so interesting too is that, going back to Nadsat, I think the reason why they use this language is because we need to feel like Alex is foreign to us. We need to feel like there's this big generational gap between us and him. We are not anything like him. We are not connected to him. We barely understand him. And so with him being a kind of alien to us, we are free to hate him, fear him, have every negative assumption that we can of him, because he is just so different from us. He's separated from us, even down to his communication, that we don't understand him. We fear what he does. We see him commit these petty crimes and we feel negatively, which means that when the Ludovico technique is raised, we briefly consider it. And then the novel gets way more complex. It starts to ask all these difficult questions of, is this a meaningful way of combating crime or making justice exist more in the world? If things are trending towards this direction, what can really be done? And how does society even get to this point? At its heart, I would say this is a novel about the failure of institutions, that larger forces in society were unable to prevent this, which means that the individual is the one who suffers, that the victims of a failure of societal constructs, like school, like prison, like the police, like corrections, like all of these roles, when all these things fail, it becomes the individuals who suffer most deeply for it. And it's a bleak book, it's a depressing book. It's one of those mid-19th century books that just says, hey, sorry, mid-20th century books that says, hey, the human race is bad, and what you gonna do about it? Which bothers me, because I already know the human race is bad. You don't need to tell me that. I give it the book I actually give a 4 out of 5. I think the way the book is structured, the narrative, the use of language, I think it all comes together quite well. I was really shocked by how powerful of an emotional response I got to this book, and how drastic it changed my viewpoint of Alex from hating him to pitying him. I think it was very difficult to achieve that. It is a hard reading experience. I would read maybe 30 pages in a day, whereas other books I could read like 100 pages in a day. it's very slow going because you have to keep looking up words, you have to keep making sense of this barely English dialogue, but it's powerful. It's really strong. I thought it did everything that it set out to do really well. Tedious and at times a bit too gruesome, but good. 4 out of 5. Okay, and last book for June. This is I Am Homeless, If This Is Not My Home by Lorrie Moore. I would have said one of my favorite authors. If you asked me in 2020 or 2019, I probably would have said Lorrie Moore is my #1 favorite author, because back then I really wanted to be a short story writer. I really was focusing on the short story medium, and the short story writer that I thought was doing some of the best work was Lorrie Moore. She has such an emotional writing style. She can flair language, use interesting symbols, interesting motifs, but also make you feel such a complex emotion, not just simple happiness, sadness, but really layered emotions based on human experiences that are universal and that connect to us. I thought her short stories worked really, really well. And reading this novel, which came out in 2023, I'm Homeless, If This Is Not My Home, I realized, and I said this to a coworker, she's very good at writing about sad people in sad situations. She's very good at making sad characters not feel mopey, not feel overwrought, but at the end of the day, you are still reading about sadness, and you're reading about aesthetic sadness. You're reading aestheticized sadness, people being sad in beautiful ways. And so, when I first encountered Lorrie Moore, I was also quite a sad person. I was in a job that I didn't like, and I was in the part of my life where I didn't really know what I was doing. It was a very bleak and angsty time of my life, and I really connected with Lorrie Moore because I felt like she could express sadness and entrapment and loneliness and disconnection in such a poignant way that I didn't feel like I was being talked down to or pitied, but someone really understood my emotions, and that was cool. Reading this now, I'm thankfully much happier. I am in a good job with a good environment, good friends. I'm happy a lot more often, and so it's interesting to see this and almost go into a sense of tourism back to my old self and look at how things that would have made my old self really sad, but also really thoughtful, really reflective, how that affects me today. I haven't even talked about what this book's about. So we have Finn, who is a middle-aged man. He's around the time of his life where he thinks everything's going to be figured out, but he's very vulnerable to shakes. And so Finn's brother Max is in hospice care. He's about to pass away due to cancer. And Finn, at the start of the novel, goes to visit Max, tries to comfort him, but has a lot of difficulty. You can get a sense that it's Finn's first real experience of death. He doesn't really know how to conceive death, and so his conversations with Max are very empty and very blasé. He tries his best, but it's not really anything he'd do. Finn is a washed-up ex-teacher, well, teacher on sabbatical, very similar to me. Kind of fed up with the system, fed up with the way that modern life treats people like Finn, who just want to be ordinary, just want to go about their day. And so he's resting, but at the same time, his ex-wife, Lily, passes away due to suicide. And he visits Lily's grave, but she comes back as a ghost or an apparition or an undead or something. And so he and Lily go on this journey across America to try and figure out or debrief on their relationship. It's a bit weird. It's a bit odd. I used to love magic realism, and then I've kind of petered away from it. I've moved more towards literary fiction, realistic literary fiction. I actually really love naturalism now, but I do like a good magic realism here and there, and this one I think does it quite well. It uses the magic realism to give you unexpected scenarios and conversations that could otherwise never happen, but they're conversations that we want to happen, that we personally want to see the closure of a relationship and the closure of a life through this meaningful conversation that happens between these two. And it's written quite well. The dialogue is wry, it's filled with humor and sadness, it's balanced quite well. It's a little bit millennial, honestly. I feel like the values here are very millennial in the way that they use humor to cope with the negative aspects of life. But I found it quite relatable, quite meaningful. It's a very easy reading experience. It's also interspersed with these kind of strange letters about a historical woman writing letters to her passed away sister, and all of this comes together very messily. It does not give you any easy answers about life or death or meaning. But that's really what makes it pleasurable, is that you can sit down and reflect and enjoy, well, not enjoy, but like consider this journey that we're all on. And you know that the language is going to get you there, and it's going to make you feel the right emotions when you need to. That's how I would describe this. I would give it a 4 out of 5. Whoa. And that's my 7 books of June. Thank you for joining again, and I will see you guys next month. Next month, I'm starting more of a sci-fi thing, so I'm trying to catch up on a lot of sci-fi books that I should read, haven't read just yet, and they're pretty difficult. So hopefully I can take a break from all the classics for a bit, try something a little bit new, and we'll see how we go for the rest of the year. Okay, thanks for joining again. I'll see you.